everybody. My name is Melissa. My pronouns are they, she, and sha, which is a Tagalog pronoun. And I would like to welcome you to our workshop session on, we did that one, Extinction and Capitalism. So first we have Vasile Stanescu, and then we have Tony Weis. So shall I introduce the Vas first? Okay, so Dr. Vasile Stanescu is Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Mercer University. Stanescu is co-editor of the Critical Animal Studies book series published by Rodopi Brill, the co-founder of the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies. That's us. The former co-editor of the Journal for Critical Animal Studies and former co-organizer of the Stanford Environmental Humanities Project. Dr. Stanescu is the author of over 20 peer-reviewed publications on the critical study of animals and the environment. Dr. Stanescu's research has been recognized by the Woods Institute for the Environment, Minding Animals International, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Culture and Animals Foundation, the Institute for Critical Animal Studies, and the, I'm going to try to say it, Institutul Cultural Roman, the Institute for Romanian Culture, among others. Don't tell me how bad I did at that. And also we have Tony Weis, whose research is broadly located in the field of political ecology with a focus on the power inequalities and biophysical instabilities associated with globalized agriculture and food systems, including the explicit and implicit environmental externalities, subsidies that brace the competitiveness of industrial production. Over the past decade, this work has centered most of all on the transformations associated with the industrial grain, oilseed, livestock complex and the soaring scale of animal consumption and the momentous implications for the environment, food security, and interspecies relations this entails. Please join me in welcoming Vasile and Tony. I don't know why I said it like that because they've been here the whole time, but welcome them.
Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I just want to take a second to thank each of you for attending the first meeting of the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies. I so admire each of you and the work that you are doing. And I only wish that I could be there in person. And I hope that this is just the beginning of work we can do together for animals. So my article is a critique of the pro-capitalist and pro-consumerist arguments in the animal rights movement, encapsulated by the phrase, vote with your dollars. This has become, in my opinion, the dominant argument throughout the animal rights movement. It explicitly rejects activism and politics for consumerism. And the proponents claim that this system of consumerism, of buying certain products, will solve for animal liberation, species extinction, and climate change. So in my article, I take a look at 3 test cases for this proposed idea of voting with your dollars to see how it works out. The first test case I look at is that of humane meat. We all know that there is a panoply of different terms that people use: local, organic, free range, cage-free, pasture-raised, rotational grazing, regenerative farming. The industry even has a term for this panoply of terms. They call it beef with adjectives. But in practice, these terms are nearly identical in the peer-reviewed research that's done on them, and many farmers just update what they do to whatever the new term may be. So I group them all together to take a look at how humane meat actually works out. And I make 2 arguments. The first argument is that all of the peer-reviewed data has shown that this practice is both not scalable and worse in terms of both climate change and species extinction. And you can look through the article to find those citations. The second argument is that even if this was not true, it still wouldn't matter because virtually all of the companies either just actually still sell factory farmed meat or are themselves owned by the factory farm industries. So I look at 3 specific test cases of this, the most representative I can find. The first one is Chipotle. Chipotle's all of their advertising is anti-factory farm. So you can think of the scarecrow ad or back to the start. In reality, most of the meat that Chipotle sells is from factory farms. Then I look at Niman Ranch. Niman is supposedly the largest purveyor of humane meat in the world. It's not owned by Bill and Nicolette Niman anymore, since they were forced out by shareholders who wanted to lower the quality of care to increase profits. They've gone through a series of different owners. They're now wholly owned subsidiary of Purdue Farms. Niman Ranch is now just Purdue. You can't tell that from the Niman Ranch webpage, but that is the reality. Then I look at something called pasture crafted beef. Pasture crafted beef is just a brand created by Cargill. And what's fascinating by this one, even though it claims to do rotational grazing and regenerative farming, is that the cows are identical to the factory farmed cows of Cargill. There is literally no difference. It's just marketing and extra profit. And the third point on a deeper level is that we have always had cause-based marketing. So we can think of like Tom's shoes. For every pair of shoes you buy from Tom's, they used to promise to donate a pair of shoes to someone in need in Africa. And we can point out that this was hypocritical and not harmful, which it was. Tom's doesn't even do it anymore. But at least lined up, at least the argument was shoes good. What we see now is that what companies are doing is they're just buying their own critique. Chipotle's whole advertising is against companies that sell factory farm meat and claim that the animals are treated well, even though that is exactly what Chipotle does. Niman Ranch's cause, which is still on their website, is against factory farms, even though they're wholly owned by Purdue. The calls in the ads for pasture crafted beef are anti-Cargill, even though the cows are just identical. So we're seeing something truly new, where companies just market the critique of themselves. The only cause is against the very company that is now selling you the product. The second test case that I take a look at is in vitro meat. The marketing term for this is clean meat, and the critiques are almost identical. So the first one is virtually all peer-reviewed data has found that it's not scalable and that it's worse for the environment in terms of greenhouse gases, exactly the same as humane meat. The second one is that even if it was to come to market, and it hasn't come to market yet, it almost certainly would be bought by the CAFOs exactly the same way that they bought Niman, exactly the same way that they have pasture crafted beef. They've even specifically said that this is what they want to do. So any viable company they want to buy, and they're already highly invested in the industry. The third point is this is not because they want to put themselves out of business. It is because they are looking for a viable filler in order to make their product go farther. They want to sell more meat to more people. They're reaching peak meat, and they're investing in what they see as possible fillers to be able to sell more. It is not for veganism or rights, but it is, again, just marketing. The third one I look at is faux meat. The critique here is a little different. So that's like Impossible Burger. It is actually scalable. There are environmental studies that say that it can work out. However, the way it's currently being sold will achieve very little. And so the critiques here, the first part is something I call the vegan halo effect. The best example of the vegan halo effect is Doc Martens. Doc Martens is a company that sells leather boots in England. They had steadily declining sales. They were big in the 90s and were viewed as not cool sort of since then. And so to rebrand themselves, to get people to buy their product, they invented vegan Doc Martens. Now, in reality, they sell almost no vegan Doc Martens. It is at most 6% of their sales, usually less. But what the idea of selling vegan brown Martens allowed them to do was get tons of free media attention, make the company seem cool, progressive, and hip, and triple the amount of leather boots they were able to sell, vastly increasing their profit. So this idea of creating a vegan product, not to sell the vegan product, but to sell the original animal-based product is what I'm calling the vegan halo effect. So Greggs Sausage in England did exactly the same thing. They created vegan sausages. did not sell very many of them, vastly increases their sale of meat sausage. I quote from The Guardian that says one of the ways to look at this is that vegan sausage is a great marketing tool for meat sausage. Then I looked at Burger King's example in the US context. They have not sold very many of the Impossible Whoppers after the first original rush. They've kept them on the market because what they did manage to do was vastly increase their number of traditional Whopper hamburgers. The way to think about this is like, why do fast food restaurants have salads? It is basically none of their sales. Who would possibly go to a fast food restaurant to buy a salad? It's less than 2%. And they just throw them away. It's a huge loss. They don't last. They bring them in, they rot, they throw them away. So why do they keep them on the menu? To make the menu as a whole seem healthy, progressive, and to suggest that the problem is your fault. You, the consumer, are choosing to eat unhealthy. They had healthy options. That is exactly what they're doing with the Impossible Burger or these other examples that I cite. I mean, I go through Dunkin' Donuts and several others, Hardee's, all of them. They keep them as a loss leader on the menu to make them as a whole seem healthier, while in reality selling very little. The second argument, again, is simply the factory farms will buy it. They're already heavily invested. They already own several. They plan to buy more. Again, the reason is not to put themselves out of business. The reason is to create blended products. This is not theoretical. You can go to the store today. They are right there. Tyson has something called Raised and Rooted, where they take meat and blend it with these new soy proteins. Purdue has something called Chicken Plus, marketed to children to get them to eat their vegetables by eating meat. It's not to replace meat, but you can even get your vegetables by eating meat. But the main argument is they're reaching peak meat and they need to figure out a way to make it go farther. And the way to do that is to create more blended products. That's the goal. So if these capitalist pro-consumers options don't offer us much, in the conclusion, I suggest what I think we should do. If you have time to read any of the article, please just read the conclusion. My argument is that veganism should be thought of as a social justice movement in solidarity with other social justice movements. Okay, what does that mean? Three things. One, in reality, veganism is a highly diverse social movement. African Americans are disproportionately likely to become vegans within the United States context and the single fastest growing demographic. At the same time, at the top level, the movement has been truly horrible. To give the most egregious example, PETA, for many years now, has had protesters wear full Ku Klux Klan regalia in order to protest dog breeding. We can all think of a host of other examples. So we have to be in solidarity with other social justice movements, not just to build solidarity with them, but because intrinsically that is the right thing to do. Secondly, as scholars, we need to be telling the story, the true story, that the reason that we are eating meat at the level that we are now is because of white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and buying off the working class with ever cheaper meat. This story is documented, it is verifiable, and it is not yet known. And we need to be explaining that story to as many people as possible. Third, we need to be making political demands. I can't tell you what the political demand of the animal liberation movement is, but we need to be in solidarity with other groups' political demands, prison abolition, living wage, immigrant reform, and we need to be forwarding our own political demands. The one personally I favor the most is the right of consent for all animals, sexual consent. That one right, if enacted in law, would end 99% of farming tomorrow. Finally, I want to just argue against this idea that we can ever work with capitalism. For as the term factory farm would suggest, capitalism and speciesism have always worked as co-constitutive phenomenons, building and supporting each other. And only by making allies and challenging both do we ever have a chance to actually win. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad that I'm standing behind this podium so you can't see my vegan Birkenstocks. Uh, but I'd also remembered while we're talking about prison abolition, I wanted to draw your attention to the Excelsior 4 hog farm. I don't know if it's a hashtag, but if you look that up, there is in British Columbia, so-called British Columbia right now, Amy Serrano and Nick Schaefer are currently going to, or have been convicted. They've been found guilty of breaking and entering in mischief into the Excelsior hog farm and trespassing. I don't know, basically a bunch of nonsense. And they are facing 10 years. So look that up and do something about it. You tell me what to do. Anyways, we also have now commentary pre-recorded from Dinesh Wadiwel.
Many thanks to the organisers of the conference. It looks amazing, and it was lovely to receive an invitation to be part of it. I'm very sad that I can't be there in person. I want to acknowledge the land that I'm on. I'm speaking today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This is located in inner Sydney, Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded on this land. It's such an honour to speak here and respond to my old friend Vasile. It is also, as always, a daunting task. Vaz has consistently exemplified some of the best and most principled scholarship in critical animal studies, and he's always a hard act to follow. Vaz's paper situates consumer veganism within the context of the capitalist economic system. Before I briefly outline Vaz's approach, I want to define capitalism, at least the way that I see it. And I have to say that the way I see it is framed partly by, it's a quasi-Marxist approach. I think we could describe capitalism as an economic system where production aims at a continuing accumulation of surplus. The typical form it takes today is industrial, and usually involves the overproduction of commodities in order to amass wealth, that is, to create a surplus of money. Many resources, that is labour, materials, energies, are all ruthlessly sucked into this machine of capitalism for this purpose, that is, to create money. In this economy, we have very little intrinsic need for many of the commodities that are overproduced, literally spewed out by capitalism. But the goal of the economic system is not to meet needs, at least directly. Rather, it is to produce money by producing lots of stuff. This logic of continual extraction and overproduction is basically killing the planet, as we all know. But the drive for production continues endlessly. Our whole society is apparently geared towards it. And this is why David Harvey describes capitalism as, quote, a bad infinity, end quote. It is for this reason that in order to understand capitalism, we need to understand both production and consumption together. In a strict sense, the decisions made by consumers on an everyday level only tell us one part of the story of capitalism. The other story is the drive of production to endlessly produce surplus and endlessly make stuff in order to generate this surplus or this profit. Given this context, it is no surprise that we find challenges with the ability of consumer veganism to actually challenge capitalist animal agriculture. And by challenge, what I mean by that is to actually reduce the number of animals bred, contained, and killed within food systems. There are a number of different sites where this focus on the production or on the site of consumption, there's been many sites where this strategy has been taken, and the way in which capitalist agriculture or attempts to reform capitalist agriculture have conformed to these logics. Vaz has described three trajectories and also their limits. Firstly, there's been a strong advocacy for a return to lower intensity forms of animal agriculture, locavorism or happy meats, And these are seen as a solution to both the environmental problems associated with the factory farm, but also as apparently a more ethical solution to the factory farm. As Vaz highlights, it is debatable whether such solutions are actually more sustainable than plant-based food systems, and it's also difficult to imagine that they can be scaled up to become a significant component of global food supplies. Further, as Vaz points out, large-scale animal agriculture producers have already seized upon these local ethical meats as a useful product line within their portfolios, that is, as another means to make money. Secondly, we've seen an investment in so-called clean meats. Again, it is debatable whether these lab-based meats are actually environmentally sustainable solutions. And again, the massive investment in these industries by animal agriculture companies only highlights the limits of these products in being able to be anything but a niche consumer option. Thirdly, we've seen the development of plant-based faux meat options. These are in some respects interesting, but as Vaz points out, at least in the context of fast food industries, there's limited evidence whether these have actually reduced meat consumption. Indeed, perhaps paradoxically, they have actually led to increased meat consumption. As a result of these failed trajectories, Vaz, I think quite rightly, says we need to imagine veganism as not simply a consumer movement. Instead, we need to see veganism as a social justice movement. I agree. But I'd like to reframe this in a slightly different way. Instead, I'd like to ask, what does veganism look like as an anti-capitalist movement? Or perhaps in a different vein, what sort of movement do we need to take on capitalist animal agriculture? To make sense of this, I want to go back to my definition. That is the definition of capitalism I put forward. That is, as an economic system where production aims at a continuing overproduction in order to accumulate surplus. Some animal advocates would argue that the factory farm represents a pinnacle example of our so-called speciesism. Actually, based on how I understand capitalism, I would put this in a different way. The factory farm represents the brutal meeting point of a prevailing hierarchical anthropocentrism and the capitalist economic system. It is a handshake between these two social relations. The factory farm would not be possible without these two structural forces coming together. That is, a hierarchical anthropocentrism that imagines animals as inferior beings that may be utilised without any limits for human utility, and capitalism, an economic system that commits to overproduction using high-volume industrial techniques in order to create profit. So-called speciesism does not in itself quite capture the cause of this problem. But consumer veganism does not either. Vegan products are now being proliferated because they are now being produced en masse by an economic system that sees utility in this production. Expanded production means more surplus for producers. Certainly, it is true that capitalism needs consumers to buy these products. You need consumers to desire meat. However, it is fantastical to believe that voting with our dollars will address capitalist animal agriculture alone. What we need is a politics of production. That is a politics that is able to zero in and constrain animal agriculture and directly address its logics. To an extent, as Vaz says, this is about social justice movement building, working with other social movements which share alliance goals for structural transformation. However, I want to put another idea on the table. In the first half of the 20th century, anti-capitalist movements were not comprised of diverse, autonomous, and occasionally disparate social movements in the way that they appear to be today. Instead, anti-capitalism was by and large led by unions, and more particularly by radical revolutionary parties. Of course, we know from the history books that the Revolutionary Party had severe problems. One of these was in terms of representation. In many countries and contexts, these parties merely represented white, male, straight workers. And these same parties, of course, were not in the least bit interested in the rights and interests of animals. However, the one advantage of these parties is that they created a space where people could work together to dream of, to intellectualize the kinds of societies we would need to build to replace capitalism. Today, as our economic system takes a wrecking ball to the planet, I think we need a revolutionary party or revolutionary parties more than ever before. But this will need to be a party or set of parties that look radically different from the white, male, heterosexual parties of the early 20th century, and will need to have very different goals, including for a food system that will not destroy the planet and might provide justice to animals. Perhaps for the first time, anti-capitalist animal liberation movements have a chance of being part of this conversation. In this respect, I'm perhaps less curious about what an anti-capitalist veganism looks like. Instead, I wonder, what would it look like if animal liberation is actually centrally part of movements against capitalism? To me, this future is yet to come. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. It always takes me a second to get back on the mic because I have to finish writing down the last thing that the person said. So, thank you, Dinesh. So now we're going to shift to Tony's. Oh, discussion. Haha. How long do we have? "35 after." Okay, I'll tell you how many minutes that is once I do some math. 23 minutes. Okay. Well, does anyone want to kick us off? I can kick us off. I just remembered while listening to Dinesh there, when he said a food system that will not destroy the planet, I remembered what Margaret said from the other day about not picking all the medicines. So I think we can also think about that during this discussion, potentially. A hand. Yes, I'm doing technological magic right now. Victoria, please.
All right. Hi, Vas. So good to see you again. And yeah, so I really enjoyed your talk, and I really enjoyed Dinesh's comments as well. And it made me feel a little bit called out because I do have a pair of the vegan Dr. Martens, and also I admit to buying the fancy 100% simulated chicken nuggets from the supermarket that are supposed to taste exactly like chicken. I was a bit underwhelmed by them because they tasted like dough to me. But anyways, I find your comments just I find them very piercing about like just how so much of the vegan movement has become centered around these habits of consumption and products, and like buying particular products. And that's something I've seen a lot over the years, and just total erosion of any kind of political consciousness, any kind of class consciousness, really. And one of the most what stands out in my mind as one of the most egregious examples that I've seen in recent history was in the before times in 2019. We had an event in Toronto, and it was about the vegan washing of Israeli apartheid. And in the local animal rights community in Toronto, there were some people who were extremely upset about it, and they accused anyone who was attending the event of dividing the vegan movement, which just shows how much the consciousness of that community just seems to be centered around how apolitical it is, and like just how neoliberal their mentality is through and through. And yeah, and I'm like, just that's something that I just find extremely frustrating. And secondly, I wanted to ask your thoughts on, because what I see more and more, at least from like various interactions I've had online, like especially with younger people, like in various like kinds of self-identified leftists, is there's this mentality more and more that that veganism is incompatible with leftism in like some way or another, which I just find totally, I just find it to be such an absurdity. But yeah, but they will claim that veganism is inherently anti-indigenous. They will claim that it's inherently racist, that it's inherently ableist, which is my favorite one as a person with disabilities. But yeah, but there's just, I've heard people claim that veganism is inherently eco-fascist and vegans aren't real leftists. And like, and it just seems like it's just such just a total mental wall to try to break through. And it is just, I just find it so enormously frustrating. And I wanted to ask your thoughts about countering that in the culture.
Sure. I would say that we tend to dismiss these claims as untrue, and they are untrue. I mean, obviously, there's nothing inherently incompatible.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we have to take some responsibility. It is too much of an ask for other social justice movements to get into the minutia of veganism. What they're going to look at are the major representations, and they are wholly accurate that the major representations are pretty horrible. And so why are we running ads that make fun of domestic violence if we want solidarity with survivors? I mean, why does Peter Singer, and he claims it's because of animal rights, do the worst kind of ableism and eugenics? And he says, this is based on my animal rights ideas. So how are we going to build solidarity with disability communities when the so-called father of animal rights still publicly makes these comments? And at the very minimum, we need to be denouncing this. Instead of dividing the movement, we have to realize that is not our movement at all. That is antithetical to everything that I believe in and the very definition of veganism. And so, I mean, we need to start with where we can actually make real changes and then articulate things, not in this slapdash terrible way that you see of so-called that you'll see when they try to do intersectionality, but a real one about the reason why we meet at this level is because of this history of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and buying off the white working class, and point out these solidarities. That's what I think.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I don't disagree at all that is really, like, when you look at the major representations that most people see, like, I completely agree, and I completely agree that is something that we have to reflect on and like we have to take seriously. But that is at the same time, like, some of the claims I've heard, I've heard people like claim that like just basically any suggestion that you know, maybe animals shouldn't be treated as commodities is like eco-fascistic, like just the insistence that like animals really have any value to their lives at all, or that like animals' consent needs to be respected at all, and that like maybe animals' lives have more value than just getting churned up into a bacon sandwich or something like that, and which I just find incredibly frustrating.
Yes, it is very frustrating indeed. I want to bash my head against a wall sometimes. Okay, let's go to Tracy and then Jess and then Margaret.
Mine's pretty quick. I mean, I share Victoria's frustration and Melissa's frustration at these claims being made over and over. And I agree with Vasile. It's just what's going on with PETA that they do these campaigns, whether it's a fur campaign, a domestic violence campaign, you know, ableist campaign. What's going on with them, and why are PETA and Singer the people that everyone knows? How do we address that question as well? That was just, yeah, what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I guess I'll just throw out that PETA's whole philosophy is shock and getting attention. And as media becomes more saturated, what is shocking just steadily escalates. And they're very clear that they don't care what the other effects are. They're single issue, whatever is best for the animals. So if dressing in Klan uniforms is what now shocks people enough to get attention, that's what they'll do. And they have measurements to see how many people call in angry, and that's a success because at least they're calling, at least they're getting the message out. So that is their mindset. But yeah.
So that success turns the anger against the rest of us as well. Success.
Yeah, as I'm fond of saying, I'm so tired of winning. I mean, everywhere I look, supposedly we're winning like never before, except for the only measurement that matters, which is the number of animals killed, and that just steadily goes up.
Hello, thank you so much, Vas. This was really, really interesting. So I was reflecting in the wake of this presentation on what it is about animal liberation movements that attracts this kind of interest in consumer solutions. And I want to put forward something that I think is maybe going to feel provocative, but I wonder if this sort of foundational relationship between animal liberation politics and veganism is in some way the kind of gateway to that politics of personal purity and consumer choice as being a focus of the movement. Because if you think about, people feel well entitled to be prison abolitionists without ensuring that they don't purchase any products from a company that uses prison labor in the United States, for example, or labor organizers don't necessarily make sure that all their clothes are purchased from union shops. But it is really a dyed-in-the-wool fact of people who are fighting for animal liberation that it's strongly associated with this consumer choice of veganism. And so I was wondering how you would think about that framing of veganism as one among the consumer choices that leads towards the orientation you're describing, or if you would see that as a separate kind of decision and why.
That is a brilliant question and a brilliant comment. I'll try to give some provisional answers. So the first one I would say is that it goes to the very founding of the movement. So even though Peter Singer's text is titled Animal Liberation, and the introduction makes solidarity with other liberation movements, the book itself calls for no political project. It calls for no laws at all. It only calls for consumerist choices, a boycott. So from the get-go, animal liberation has been articulated as a consumerist choice. And I would say that you're exactly right. These other movements realize that it is actually impossible to be pure in the world that we live now, and that we should keep struggling, and that is actually a deficiency that we have in the animal liberation movement, where we have too much of focus in impossible purity. I don't even consume sugar, or try not to, as much as I can because of the way it's processed. But it's still the case that everything I do harms animals. I mean, where I live harms animals. The roads I drive on break up migration patterns and harm animals. So it is silly to imagine that somehow I can achieve personal purity through my consumptive choices. And when these leftist movements critique us for this, they're right that vegans who articulate it that way are being classist, exclusionary, and non-political. So it is true that you can't have any ethical consumption under capitalism. And so I would say that for whatever reason, that mentality has taken over the mainstream movement. You can see someone like Bruce Friedrich, who I actually really respect, who one time mooned the Queen to try to create veganism. And he now has a full-page ad in the New York Times where he says, I've given up on activism. It doesn't work. My goal now is just to work on factory farms because capitalism is the way to solve for animal rights. And that's the former vice president of PETA. Just take a second and Google it. It's not hard to find. So that is what has occurred. And so I think we have to push back against it.
Okay, Margaret.
Oh, goodness, this has been amazing. I'm particularly taken by your statement that meat consumption is driven by white supremacy and buying off of the working class, because one of the first things I remember reading about the history of meat consumption was how gendered it was. And thinking about the aspects of what might be the pleasure that's being sold in meat consumption that would appeal to the working class, because it's not just about sating hunger, it's about something else. And so I'm wondering, what is your view on what the pleasure that is being offered as enticing the working class toward meat? What is that interest? Like, how are they getting that market, so to speak? And then how does it relate to masculinity?
I love your question, Margaret. So in Carol Adams, The Social Politics of Meat, she not only talks about the gender connection, she actually has a section on the effeminate rice eater that unfortunately just wasn't picked up by larger scholarship. But I think it's one of the most important stories that we can tell. And so while colonial powers were colonizing countries, they made this argument that the reason why these colonized folk in India and in Mesoamerica were colonized was because they didn't eat enough meat. And they claimed they could fix that problem by forcing them to eat meat. And we can see that now where there's current plans to try to get India to eat more meat than ever before, which is part of why these environmental destructions are happening. In the United States context, they intentionally and specifically tried to buy off the union white working class that were striking because their wages were too low. And their articulation was, we can't afford meat because of the wages you're paying us. They said, I'm not approving this, but they said, we have to eat like Asian immigrants. All we can buy is rice because we don't have enough money for a chicken in every pot. And so there was an intentional move, in part funded by the US government, to make meat ever cheaper. Basically, we'll exploit animals more to be able to buy off our exploitation of the white male working class. And it worked. Since that time, so this starts in the 1920s, escalates in the 1940s, meat has actually been negatively correlated with inflation in the US. So year after year, everything except meat gets cheaper and meat gets more expensive and meat gets cheaper and cheaper. In the US, dairy is a zombie industry. If you cut off all the US subsidies today, there would be no more dairy. It loses money every year. How is there still a dairy industry? Because of these subsidies. Why do we subsidize? I subsidize because I pay taxes. Why do we all subsidize like never before? Well, the US government may not give you healthcare, and they may not give you the ability to go to schools without getting shot, and they may not give you a host of other social things, but what they will give you is cheap meat, no matter what. And we can see right now the irritation and anger people have about inflation, and the primary way you see it articulated is about how much they have to pay for meat. So cheap meat makes people feel rich and happy, no matter how exploited the animals are, and no matter how exploited they are.
Sorry, again, writing down everything.
Same here. Thank you so much. That's this has just been awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Tracy, is your hand raised again?
Yes, it's quick though. Again, just a bit of pushback on this idea on the ethics of purity notion, the question that Jess brought up. I get the feeling that most of us know that there is no purity, like as Vas said, like the roads we drive on, the ink we use, like we hurt animals, where we live, when we go for a hike, we hurt animals, we hurt the environment all the time. Who among us think we're pure? I mean, I find that argument really frustrating where people are like, you know what, purity can't be achieved, so I don't have to do anything. I can still work on animals and stuff. Like, don't worry, I'm just gonna shove this cheese in my face. You know, I just find that like really frustrating because so much of these are turned against us that, I mean, and again, that's what gets the attention, right? So I just wanted to kind of push back against the notion that we are to blame for that. Like who among us, we can be accused of striving for purity, but if we think we're achieving it, we're wrong. So.
No, I agree with you. And so, so many people dismiss us wrongly out of hand for that argument, claiming that like what we care about is purity. There are some people who do this, Gary Francione, but I think most vegans are in a particular sense of like agony or the fact that we can't achieve what
Thank you so much. Victoria, I do see your hand. However, I am going to go to Tony because he has not had a question yet.
Hi, Vaz. Great talk. I was just wanting to pick up a couple things. One that followed from what Tracy had just said about the moral purity. I was at an event with Peter Singer at my university a few years ago, and for him, he was pumping his book on ethical capitalism, and that's not the book. It's about philanthropy and strategic philanthropy, and he was talking about it in the context of the climate emergency. And for me, it wasn't so much about, part of his perspective there seemed to just be out of desperation, where it was like he couldn't think beyond capitalism. And in some ways, I feel like some of the vegan politics isn't necessarily entirely around ethical purity. It's around hoping for a vegan Elon Musk to come along, in Impossible and Beyond Meat. And another thing I think I would play up maybe in the paper is the extent to which the plant meat sector is getting really swallowed up right now. It's quite a kind of a warp speed of the big meat and dairy eggs are really coming into that sector, and they're both creating their own brands within, they're marketed in a way that it's not usually obvious. And then they're swallowing up plant-based products that are out there already. And I think that's another really dangerous trajectory. And I think it ultimately relates to something you're talking about in the social justice side of things, which is a lot of the vegan politics hasn't really thought about plant alternatives in the context of farming livelihoods. And I think it's one of the really important strands of I think what you're talking about is trying to connect vegan politics to good agrarian livelihoods. So that's just something I would throw out there.
Thank you.
Awesome. Good agrarian livelihoods. Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. I think we're going to shift now to, I also realized I didn't actually read out the titles of either of these papers. Whoops. And then I was like, oh, there was a joke and I missed it. A bull market. Yeah. The failure of capitalism to solve for climate change, species extinction, and animal liberation. Wow. I can't talk fast. And now that's what we just did. Now we're doing Tony's A Violent Narrowing of Animal Life. So over to you.
So basically the essence of the paper is thinking about the place of animals in environmental change. And it's dealing with a long running frustration for me, and probably for pretty much everyone in this room, which is the speciesism and blinders that is so pervasive in environmentalism, or what most of us might think of as environmentalism, and certainly the conservation side of things. And this is something that, the dichotomy between conservation organizations organized around declines of charismatic wild animals struggles to stop those declines, and while at the same time paying little or no attention to the explosive population growth of and the conditions of life for a small range of animal species. And obviously how that explosive growth then bears ultimately on the lives of the animals that they're concerned for. So that the blinders is something, again, that is, I'm sure, familiar to everyone here. And again, when you think about big conservation, wildlife is so front and center in their names. Even the Wildlife Conservation Society, Flora and Fauna International, of course, the WWF. With the panda icon, One National Wildlife Federation. And to start off, I just thought I would give 3 examples of the blinders. One comes from a Sierra Club meeting I was at in my grad school days, a long time ago. And there was a time within the Sierra Club some efforts to try to make it more attuned to environmental justice. So there were some people pushing really hard there. And I'll never forget, there was the meal was just pure overflowing with meat, not a vegetarian option to be had. And there was a few people that tried to say something, and they were just almost laughed at for even raising it there. And just the dichotomy could not have been more stark, that the blinders to animal agriculture as an environmental issue. The next quick example I'll give you is from the landscape I come from, which is Southern Ontario. I'm from Waterloo. I live in London. I'm at the University of Western Ontario. And a few years ago, it was termed by a conservation organization as the crisis ecoregion, which probably most of Canada is a crisis ecoregion, but this is the most crisis ecoregion in terms of species endangerment in Canada. The Carolinian region, bioregion, is a beautiful landscape where it exists, but it exists in tiny, tiny pockets. And most of the large animals are long gone. And so there are a lot of scientists and people I know and deeply respect that are working really hard at ecological restoration. They're working diligently at, working at little pockets of land, trying to restore them ecologically as best they can, obviously in the absence of most of the large animal life. And a few years ago, when this report came out, I forget the journal, but it was a prominent Canadian environmental organization that had published or was behind the paper, and it got a fair bit of attention, and including in the London Free Press. And the London Free Press is not something that would normally be paying attention to this or describing our landscape as a crisis ecoregion. Around the same time and in the intervening years, the Free Press has, and I don't want to use it as a saying that it's all that conscious of the crisis ecoregion focus, but around the same time, there's this kind of overlapping period where there's been a lot of coverage of this maple leaf poultry plant that is almost $1 billion worth of investment, and it was consistently celebrated as bringing these thousands of jobs to London, and it is going to involve the slaughter of 200 to 300,000 birds on a daily basis, 75 million to 100 million birds in an annual basis. And there's this kind of narrative of this as this jobs creator, this engine of growth, but also this as a green site. And there was a huge push to try and sell this as the highest level of environmental efficiency in processing and packing plants. And there's just this incredibly, again, these stories in many ways different, but they're unfolding in the similar time frame. And there is just no connection in the conservation community to how these two things relate to each other. The fact that our landscape is filled with tens of millions of chickens that are going to be flowing into this gigantic green plant, and how does that bear on restoration, the challenges of restoration, habitat fragmentation, that sort of thing. And the last example is one that I come to at the end of my paper, which is headlines probably some of you or many of you have seen. It got one of those academic journal articles that gets a whole life in the media. The 3 billion less birds in North America study that came out, I think, around 2019. An estimate that North America wide, there's about 3 billion less birds today than there was in 1970. If you just type in the 3 billion birds, you'll find headlines from environmental organizations, but also it got all kinds of traction in the US and Canadian media. And so there's a lot of conservation organizations paying a lot of attention to that study, and it's a jarring headline to think of North America as having 3 billion less wild birds, and many of the species that were discussed in the great talk earlier from Patrice. In that, all of the coverage that I've seen of that in the media or conservation organizations, not a single mention is made of the fact that bird life is exploding in North America. In that same period of 3 billion less birds in North America, the number of slaughtered birds annually leapt from 3.8 billion to 12.3 billion birds slaughtered in North America as of 2020. Okay, so this is something I've spent a lot of time focusing on, is this industry, this trajectory of growth on the production and consumption side. With respect to the consumption side, one of the things I've stressed is this idea of the meatification of diets, and how, like what Vas was saying, the importance of it in working class consciousness is one part of the story. But if you look at a planetary scale, the average human being is consuming almost twice as much meat today as in 1960. from 23 kilograms of meat per year to 43 kilograms of meat per year over a period in which the human population rose from about 3 to 8 billion. So one of the things I've spent a lot of time focusing on is the, again, how environmental organizations need to take this trajectory of production and consumption seriously. And so a big focus of my attention has been on the resource budgets and pollution loads of industrial agriculture, and both the industrial monoculture side of things and the industrial livestock operations, and thinking about how these environments are organized as a basis for understanding their resource budgets and pollution loads. And then also focusing on the inefficiency at their nexus, the extreme wastage or nutritional drain, sometimes been described to as a net nutritional drain that, funneling all these resource intensive products of monocultures through these islands of animals, just how inefficient this is. So a key premise in so there's the foundation, and I'll keep the rest of this very brief. But this key motivation here is to try to convey this contradiction. I've been wrestling with this in many ways. And in the course of my work on the environmental implications of industrial agriculture, trying to draw attention to these multidimensional pollution resource budgets and pollution loads. And one of the starting points in this paper is that I think there's all kinds of signs that this is some of this is getting through to environmental organization, mainstream environmentalism. Certainly that Sierra Club meeting I'd mentioned to start, with, not a vegan or a vegetarian choice on the table. I don't think that would happen. I've not been to a Sierra Club meeting in ages, but I can't imagine that would happen today. And I think one of the big ways this is all registering is with respect to climate change. So the climate change, head of the climate change, the organization, the IPCC, in 2007 or 8 made a famous statement that, this is one of the most important things any individual can do is to consume less meat. He didn't say no meat, he said less, but that was, that's been part of, I think, the growing recognition within climate science that this matters with respect to climate change. And a few years ago, the IPCC report on land, I think, presented this case in its strongest terms, that the extraordinary resource intensity of industrial monocultures, of industrial livestock, and the really destructive nature of pasture on a planetary scale is a huge issue. And it was, again, I think it's the loudest terms I've seen it in the IPCC report. And I quote one of the authors of the report, not from the report itself in this paper, but it's a quote that appeared in the BBC, where he basically says in very, very strong language, plant-based foods are way better for the environment. And that message, I think, is getting through on the climate front. And there's some indication that on the biodiversity side of things, there is more and more attention to this. Bill Ripple, I think, is a great example. He's a really, really eminent conservation biologist, and he's been saying for at least a decade, livestock matters, and thinking about habitat loss and fragmentation. So there is this, I think, breakthrough that has happened, and I don't think there's any going back from that. I think that within climate science and biodiversity activism, there's more and more recognition that livestock matters at some level. But, and this is a really big but, in all of the assessment, the resource budget and pollution load assessments of livestock, there's always a rank ordering that appears. And this goes way back. Francis Moore Lappé, the famous Diet for a Small Planet book in the early 70s, one of the first, probably the first person to really draw attention to the destructive trajectory of funneling huge volumes of industrial monocultures through concentrated populations of animals. She had this rank ordering there, and the same rank ordering is still there, of poultry being much more efficient at cycling grains and turning feed into flesh, or and also eggs with poultry. So this is something that is, again, the efficiency narratives. There's a lot for animal activism to build on, and a lot of constructive conversations can start there, but it can't just be about efficiency. And one of the things I do in this paper is position that basic situation in relation to the trajectory of livestock growth on a planetary scale and the explosive growth of poultry. which is really driving it's the biggest driving force in increased meat production and consumption on a planetary scale. So I look at the extraordinary growth of poultry, which is something, and in 1960 was about 13% of world meat production. Today, it's over 40% of all meat production is poultry birds. And it has risen at much faster rates than ruminant animals and much faster than pigs too. So this, the discussion of efficiency, if it's kept on that terms, is something that I think that it feeds into the momentum, this really powerful momentum that's already there towards poultry production as the most efficient of, or what I've tried to describe as the least inefficient of all livestock, because it's still very inefficient. There's still all kinds of nutritional wastage in that process of cycling feed through concentrated animals. But again, I think it's really important for animal advocates to, when you're thinking about the efficiency as a starting point for constructive conversations with environmentalists, to think about that possibility, that the people that might be inspired by some of that argumentation, that there's so much out there, I think, that is leading them to think, well, poultry's better. It's the least impactful. And there's also that horrible term, the polo vegetarians. I don't know if people are familiar with that term, which is just, I can't wrap my head around that term, but certainly things like meatless Mondays and some of these things, where they're motivated by inspiring people to eat less, but not challenging the nature of consumption in a really fundamental way. And I think that, again, that given the nature of the environmental narratives out there and the nature of momentum in agricultural production as it is, really has a potential to reinforce this explosive growth of birds. And obviously chickens is at the center of that. In 2020, 75 billion birds were killed for food, and 71 billion of those were chickens. But even rising faster than chickens is ducks. And I think this is, if I had to guess, the duck story in Asia is growing really, really dramatically. And so it's certainly, again, chickens, the overwhelming basis of that in terms of biomass or in terms of individual animal lives, but other birds are growing very quick too. So again, I think there's a lot of possibilities in terms of constructive conversations with environmentalism, but there is this, I think, very serious danger that animal advocacy has to be attuned to how the efficiency narrative can again relate to this unfolding momentum orienting towards poultry. And part of that is rooted in the feed efficiency story, that other birds are better at converting feed to flesh and eggs than, well, obviously mammals don't create eggs, but better at converting it to other foods than are mammals. So ultimately, one of the things I do in this paper is work through an argument for thinking about challenging environmentalists to think about not just efficiencies, but thinking about how these spaces are organized. And this is something I do in my work on the conceptual framework of the ecological hoofprint is something I've tried to do, is draw attention to the resource budgets and pollution loads by thinking about how productive environments are organized, the biophysical barriers to scale, the ways they're overridden, and also not just focusing on the environmental implications, but thinking about how that helps us understand how the conditions of animal life are organized in these spaces. So the pressures of scale, how it is giving shape to the way animals are produced and killed. So ultimately, I arrive at this idea of as a sort of counterpoint to a term that's grown in conservation biology is the term defaunation, which is something that, as conservation biologists have stressed, the biodiversity crisis is so much deeper than extinctions. And the term defaunation is used to reflect broad-based population declines amongst non-threatened and endangered species. And I say we need to also think on there's this other side of animal life, this other great trajectory that we might think of as commodification faunation, this huge and growing populations of animals whose lives are utterly disregarded in production. And one of the ways when I try to join these two things together and thinking about both as different aspects of the violent narrowing of animal life. I come back to some of the narratives that have held with respect to the wild animal side of things in environmentalism. So one thing I very briefly mentioned in the conclusion is E.O. Wilson's famous, or I think it's fairly famous, the Eramocene. There's a million different terms for the Anthropocene, but the Eramocene is one that's got a fair bit of traction in the arts, and it's got a fair bit of traction in the media and in environmental humanities. And he uses it as a term for the age of loneliness. And that term loneliness, I think, really resonates with some long-running themes in environmentalism of loss, of emptiness. There's, I mentioned a paper about the empty forests, and then even going back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, where the Silent Spring metaphor is a spring without songbirds being induced by the toxic burden of the wave of pesticides that was unfolding. And one of the things I think it's important to stress is that there is a power to thinking about that loss, loneliness, emptiness, silence. But we also need to be thinking of the trajectory of animal life as seething, cacophonous, and full of anguish. And how do we convey the conditions of animal life in a way that really resonates with environmentalists, and keeping that, again, there is a place for starting really constructive conversations around the subject of efficiency. But if we can think about how these environments are organized and finding ways to connect it to the sorts of consciousness that are driving environmentalists, I think it's a really important challenge for animal advocacy right now. And I hope the idea of the violent narrowing of animal life offers something to that.
Thank you very much. And now let's hear commentary from Tracy.
All right. Can I share my screen just so that if you're in speaker view, my face is still tiny in the side, so that it's not giant on the screen? Yes, awesome. Is it open now? All right. All right, good. Okay, so I want to say first how disappointed I am not to be there in person. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I started getting sick on Sunday, and I tested negative on 2 COVID tests, but I have a cough and I was congested, and I figured no one would want to sit next to me on public transport or in that room. So I'm sadly here. But I also wanted to thank Chloe and Callie for all of their work that all of the work they put into this, and how gracious they've been over my frantic emails for the last few days. I'm hoping my voice will hold out, and I'm aware that time is we're like already over time, almost over time. So and I can talk very quickly, so I will take advantage of that that feature too. One of the things I was struck by in Tony's paper was he talks about the danger of debilitating fatalism. And I was very struck by that because it's a phenomenon that I fight all the time myself. And so I used it as a kind of organizing principle here because yeah, that struggle is real. And I didn't talk to Tony before. It sounds like we kind of coordinated, but we didn't, because what I wanted to start with was his conclusion, which I thought had a very, had so many elements for a rich and productive discussion that focused on multiple themes and elements in that conclusion that I wanted to just draw attention to. And Tony drew your attention to them as well. So I'll go through them quickly. I was struck by his passage when he talks about Rachel Carson and her warning in 1962 that the use of pesticides was going to result in this silent spring, this loss of bird song. And this idea that birds are kind of the canaries in our toxic planetary coal mine. And the point that he made in his talk from the paper that between 1970 and 2020, we have 3 billion fewer songbirds in North America. At the same time, the slaughter of chickens and birds for consumption went from 3.8 billion to 12.3 billion. And so he tells us why the situation occurs. And so what I thought would be interesting to talk about is, why did we let it happen? And how can we address it? Are we past the tipping point in terms of debilitating fatalism? I often wake up and say, yeah, we've passed the tipping point. So, you know, and it doesn't make me want to run out and eat a burger, but does make me want to go back to sleep. So what can we do? And that's going to be another theme in the points that I'm making here. Like, what can we do? I wanted to ask Tony to talk more about this idea of the ereminus. How do you pronounce it? Ereminus? I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. It's like Benedict Cumberbatch and Penguin. I can't do it. So anyways, to discuss it more and pushing this idea of the age of loneliness as an effective way for change. But if we go that direction, does that also lead to debilitating fatalism? And then it ties in with Laurie and Patrice's papers this morning too, like what role does hope play? And Laurie suggests that hope is actually a bad thing because it makes you push your agenda into the future, and it's something that subdues rather than promotes revolutionary change. This idea too that, and I won't try to say it, Penguin, it potentially obscures animal suffering and anguish and noise and sound. And I think sound is very important. So how do we convey this suffering? As activists, how do we get that message across? Why won't people listen? To try and talk about, if we can figure out why people won't listen, maybe we can figure out how they will listen. And I threw up Vegan Sidekick here because he fights this fight all the time. And we can talk about whether you like him or not, whether you like his approach or not. I tend to like his approach, and that he's constantly fighting this and saying, like, you know, a lot of these he's made into cards and you can play like bingo with them when people say to you canines though, and you're like, oh, got the card, right? So how do we address this problem? Tony's paper warns about emphasizing the impact on land and atmosphere and water, that we have already caused this shift, but the shift went from beef and lamb to chicken, which leads to more heightened exploitation and suffering. So how do we address that? How do we address that shift? How do we turn it back? And I remember a long time ago, I think it was when NYU opened their animal studies program, and they put everyone in little discussion groups. And one of the questions came up, like, you know, how successful the veal campaign was. Really successful, right? The anti-veal campaign. Like, so many people were like, oh, I can eat a baby cow. Holy smokes, I can't do that. You know, and so one of the participants is like, maybe the chicken industry funded that campaign, you know, and I'm like, if they did, let's figure out how they did it. See, this is why you don't want to sit next to me. Okay. So Tony's paper asks us to understand why, despite the focus on saving charismatic animals by the World Environmental Movement, that the movement doesn't pay attention to the forces that are constantly shrinking the habitats of charismatic animals. And one of the things that really sort of brought forth my debilitating fatalism was when he talked about the militarization of the forces that try to prevent poaching and encroachment on these protected areas. And the fact that despite parks supposedly protecting animals within parks are still dying off. So how do we address the development that threatens wildlife, especially in countries with fewer and fewer resources? How do we address the issues of poaching and wildlife markets in places where local human animal populations see their livelihood as threatened by animal protection and threatened by outsiders coming in and telling them how to live their lives? What else do I want to talk about here? I'm going to try and keep this under 10 minutes. Yeah, I talked about the militarization, very struck by that. I can read it to you if you haven't had a chance to read the paper. He writes, one of the world's most influential conservation organizations, the World Wildlife Federation, now markets a, quote, support a ranger program to donors with images of conservation officers carrying semi-automatic weapons. The Thin Green Line Foundation is also illustrative of the increasing militarization of conservation, expressly financed to train park rangers in the global south in the use of arms and surveillance tactics and to supply them with weapons, ammunition, and apparel. So something that I'd also like to talk about. Also, the problem that focusing on large charismatic species loss makes these animals ambassadors, but may obscure, as Tony argues, a recognition of the massive biodiversity crisis among animals that don't make good ambassadors. Their loss is the remaining story in a global diversity crisis. I don't know if you can hear my cat meowing, but if I sound the least bit emotional in any way, excited or angry, my cat starts to meow at me. So if you can hear her, that's what's going on. She also got opioid poisoning from the vet this week. So there you go. Okay. I also want to talk about the question that Tony raises in the paper, quote, if the population of an animal species has declined by over 90%, and it has lost 90% of its former range in the past century, but is now deemed to be relatively stable and has a non-threatened status, to what extent does this decline matter for conservation? I thought that was a really interesting question, and maybe Tony can tell us what he thinks about it. We could talk about it. Defaunation, I was also struck by that. Again, are we past the tipping point here? I agree with Tony's claims that the current environmental movement, where the problems and responses are largely detached from the dynamics of everyday life. So how do we address this disconnect? How do we connect these problems to everyday life? This is a challenge I think we really need to engage with. I really want to hear how Tony's paper talks with Darren and Lauren's paper. I think there would be a really interesting dialogue between those two. And then finally, both Tony and Vasile's papers show the ways in which violence toward all beings is embedded in capitalism. The drive to increase production means more pesticides, more disinfectants, more antibiotic use, more deaths, more maiming, more self-harm, more genetic manipulation, more zoonotic disease, more confinement, more sexual assault on animals. How do we address these issues? Or does a debilitating fatalism arise here too? I'm going to stop there so we have some time to discuss.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Okay, well, I don't know if Kelly did this on purpose, but as many of you know, I'm in my Sierra Club grad school days right now. And I'll tell you, I was the only vegan, but there was like 3 other vegetarians. It was really sad. So relatable. Anyways, questions. We have, maybe I'll put out some reminders from what Tracy said, but connections with Darren and Lauren's paper from earlier, the detached frame of everyday life, how to connect that, fatalism. Yes, let's get a mic.
Jess was saying at the break, you can always count on me and her to ask a question. I said, it's good, consistent. People know that they can count on it. Tony, I wanted to ask about like the shift chicken, and I don't think it's in your paper, but to talk about fish a little bit and the shift that's now happening from chicken to fish, because it really does feel like taking the problem and trying to move it around, you know, because in some of the fish groups I've been in, like I was in an aquaculture working group at NYU just this past year. And, you know, one of the things there, people are trying to talk about the blue washing, like the green washing, and say, you know, oh my gosh, for farm fish, they're actually eating other fish. So it's putting pressure on wild stocks of fish, so it's not good for that, and it's not going to feed the world because of the, like, all those myths and blinders that are on there. And I mean, nobody says, oh, but at least, you know, chickens eat grain and that's less bad, or cows eat grass, that's less bad. But it does seem like there's this kind of competitive thing a little bit going on with the different species and the way it's moving around. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts about that to share with us.
There's also the direct connection, right, of some fish meal going into industrial livestock and vice versa. I mean, the challenge of feeding fish is enormous. And in 1980, there was about between 1% and 2%, I think, of world fish by volume what came from aquaculture, and now it's close to half, right? And so that you know, just absolutely extraordinary growth in less than half a century is you know, reflecting the broader ill health of the oceans. But, you know, there is I think some marketing now to try to promote this as, you know, being better for the environment than land-based animals, for sure, even though, again, there's these flows going between the two systems. I think there's one of the things I was going to get into and ran out of time and space for this, but I think one thing that it's really important to think about is the parallels. I mean, there's a lot of parallels, but there's some differences in terms of how the spaces are organized. And so that's one of the things I try to get at with the, again, the framework of the ecological hoofprint that I've been working through, is to think about how productive environments are organized, the sort of logic and the pursuit of scale. And so the pursuit of scale creates certain compulsions or tendencies, but it also creates or runs into certain barriers and what I call biophysical barriers to scale. And so I think in aquaculture, you know, some of the and then there's this challenge of perpetually overriding the problems that are created by the pursuit of scale. And so in livestock, obviously antibiotics is a huge part of that override, vaccine, the proliferation of vaccines. And there's some, you know, parallels with pesticide use and with aquaculture systems. There is some differences too, like the physical mutilation side of things in industrial animal production. There's not the same story. There is a parallel in terms of genetic modification, right? Changing animal bodies to try to greatly accelerate the pace of feed conversion and growth. So I think there is a story of both parallels and then again the overlap, and then some distinctive characters. But I think you're absolutely right that there is, you know, for some, this pointing to other sectors as a means to say you're a bit better on an environmental basis. And so the other thing I wanted to get into in this paper, which I didn't, is the trajectory of the fur industry. And I think that when I talk about the organizing imperatives of the productive environments, fur has a lot of parallels to livestock in terms of the way space is organized, the disciplines, but there is also some very distinctive characters with fur, right? Because you can't slaughter animals the same way with fur as with livestock. So there's like particularly gruesome stories of death I mean, not that livestock isn't filled with very extraordinarily gruesome stories of killing, but fur, you know, the challenge of killing is different. But again, the basic premise of thinking about how these spaces are organized, to me, and this is one of the things I've really tried to stress, is a way of thinking about the resource budgets, the pollution loads, but also the conditions of animal life. And that's a basis, I think, for constructive conversations with environmentalists is to help understand that the logic of the way production is organized, the inefficiencies and the destructive character of it, the resource budget, pollution loads, the problems created by scale, the ways they're overridden, but then also how it makes us think about the way individual animal lives are disciplined or governed. And so to me, that's like, there's really fertile ground for thinking about that sort of basic logic as it relates to industrial animal production, not just in pursuit of flesh, milk and eggs, but also aquaculture systems and fur as well. So.
Okay, I see that Victoria has their hand up, and then we'll go over to Rose after.
Hi. Another brilliant talk, and I I just had a comment that I wanted to point out because I really love the title that you chose for your presentation, Tony, the narrowing of the violent narrowing of animal life, because in particular that paper you mentioned about how we see over the same time period there's this vast decrease in biodiversity, this enormous decrease in biodiversity of wild birds in North America, but at the same time, there's this enormous explosion in the number of birds forcibly bred and slaughtered for human consumption. And in terms of these conversations that we've been these very productive conversations we've been having about extinction and about settler colonialism and imperialism as well. One of the things that stands out to me all the time is that I really think that the whole history of settler colonialism can really be seen as this history of the standardization and monotonization of animal life, really, where you just have I mean, if you think about like what has happened in North America, or like what has happened in Australia, for instance, Australia in particular is known as such a hotbed of extinction because there's that combination of there being these animals that evolved in isolation that are found nowhere else in the world, and then white Europeans moving in and just plundering everything completely, and which of course was not going to turn out well for the animals, and like where you have like all this biodiversity, but then during the Columbian exchange and its aftermath, like it just becomes monotonized, or it becomes standardized, and like all the native animals like get exterminated or forcibly displaced, and then you have basically like a toddler's cookie cutter puzzle of like barnyard animals. Like now there's just these amorphous, ambiguous categories of cows, sheep, chickens, kind of like that. And it's just really this, yeah, like it's very much this narrowing of animal life, and like just this just standardization of animal life into these commodifiable units. And I was wondering if you could remark on that, because it's just something that I've been thinking about a lot, like just over the past while, that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the paper, is to think about the pursuit of scale as this, the compulsions that are driving it in the context of capitalist imperatives. And this is something that, this tendency towards biological simplification and standardization, again, in aquaculture, there's a handful of species that are dominating that explosion, right? It's, there's shrimp and salmon and trout, there's a handful that are predominant, and in livestock, as I said, the bird story is not just chickens, it's exploding ducks in industrial systems, also turkeys, and to a lesser extent goose and guinea fowl. There's also rabbits. I mean, the scale of rabbits in cuniculture and intensive rabbit rearing is bigger than a lot of people would think. But if we think about forestry, a handful of species like eucalyptus and rubber and a range of pine species, these are the standardization and simplification of landscapes, productive environment, and pursuit of scale. To make scale happen, you need biologically simplified landscapes to make landscapes conducive to labor displacing machinery. And so Wendy Wolford is a great agrarian studies scholar. She's talks in terms of the plantation-ocene. There's this seemingly infinite industry of trying to rename the problems of the Anthropocene. But the plantation-ocene, I think, captures some of that tendency towards, in agriculture, there's 10 crops that command about 75% of the world's arable land, 10, and a handful, corn, corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice, about half the world's arable land in just the big four, and then some others like sugar that are also enormous footprints. And so that tendency towards biological standardization and simplification of productive environments in monoculture agriculture and forestry, and then also when we turn to animal agriculture, I feel like it's to think about the logic through which those environments are organized, I think is a foundation for really constructive conversations with environmentalists, or I hope it is.
Absolutely. And I have to remember that word, the Plantationocene, because I think that's one of the most interesting I've heard, and like one of the most salient I've heard in terms of the project of continuously renaming the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. Can someone pass Rose a mic?
On the Plantationocene, anyone who's interested in that concept, I highly encourage you to read the work of some Black geographers who have pushed back against the erasure of enslavement from the concept of the Plantationocene. Janai Davis and a group of others wrote a paper in a geography journal that's name I'm blanking on, but please check it out. If you're going to use that term, I think you should engage with the Black theorists who have added a lot to it. My question comes from a place of having observed across Vasile's talk and Tony's talk, something that I'm also grappling with, which is that many of the most prominent ways that we have to deal with environmental problems in conservation or to deal with animal issues in animal liberation movements are not working, right? So the Vaz in your paper, it's so fascinating to read of the failure of alternative meats, right? Like you just so systematically show and how that has failed and why it will fail. And Tony, in your paper, the failure of protected areas to actually solve the problems that they're supposed to solve. And I guess one of the things that I just sort of step back from that and end up with this very basic question of political strategy in some ways, which is like, are we putting our eggs in the right baskets? And one of the other parallels that comes out of today is this acknowledgement of how the conservation movement has had such a narrow vision on wildlife and on charismatic wildlife, but they haven't saved those either. So the effort to say, oh, conservation, like you should be paying attention to other species too. Well, but it hasn't even worked for the species they are paying attention to. So it's a very empirical question in a way and a political one. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts that come from, like my colleague Jess Dempsey and I call it the extinction paradox, which is this explosion of endangered species legislation over the last 50 years and actually just declining trends almost across the board, even for the animals that are ostensibly protected. We see that everywhere, right? In climate change, in all these different areas. So what are we doing wrong and where could we be looking instead? And Laura, it's a question also for Lauren and Darren, I think, because you're critiquing conservation too, maybe in a deeper way. Anyway, I'll stop there if you have any thoughts.
I wish I had a better answer. I mean, ultimately, this has been part of the central part of my challenge, research and teaching for as long as I've been doing it, is to try to think about, how do we begin to think about environmental change in ways that are not just defensive, reactive, and emergency, sort of crisis management, environmentalism. And, with respect to conservation, in that realm, there's a lot of, I kind of scratched the surface of it, but there's a lot of discussion about the increasing militarization and defense of protected areas in contexts of just absolutely desperate pressures against those spaces. And in many ways, it's hard to see a way around that militarization if those species are to survive the near term. This is, it's a really vexing question in terms of how do you get beyond that emergency mode when that emergency mode is certainly needed in some contexts. But I think some of the answer lies in what Vas was coming to at the end of his talk, which is thinking about the defense of animals as a, challenging, trying to find ways of centering it in broad-based social justice struggles, anti-capitalist struggles. And again, that, poses all kinds of strategic challenges, but I think we can no longer, as animal advocates, be detached from broader struggles. And I think that is, the problem is that the challenges are so multidimensional that, and I, in part of this paper, I was trying to just get at some constructive ways into conversations with broadly environmentally minded people. But even broadly environmentally people are on the margins of the popular consciousness in many ways at the current moment, and all the reactionary insanity that we're in the anti-science insanity that we're in the midst of. So that is not a uplifting digression. I wish I had a better answer.
Okay, so I thought that was a fine answer. I'll be the judge of that. So we have a couple extra minutes, so we're going to have a question from Manisha. If someone could get a mic over there.
Thank you so much for these papers. I'm going to just connect them to broader conversations during the day and all this question about hope and whether to hope or not, or despair. And I think someone said debilitating. And so I'm going to also say a comment I think a few of you have heard me say in other spaces. It's just that, especially around food politics, I feel like, it is so hopeless because it's so identity and psychology driven, right? We have identities that are so tied to gender, really tied to gender, so tied to class, culture, religion, such that, we are all adult. Not only are we just all humans here, we're basically all, depending on how we count, all adults here, right? And so, maybe our focus really needs to be intervening in policy and legal spaces for kids, because before those identities get cemented and attached and entrenched, and it becomes so hard to put animals in conversation with human justice issues, because then everyone thinks it's dehumanizing and we can't talk about that. And all these specters of like proximity that offend without really being, people being educated about what you are talking about, what you are saying. Before all of that happens, there are cultural traditions that have very positive associations with animals, where people grow up not having like an othering immediately, right? More as Margaret's and other people's work have shown, like a kinship with animals are a more positive relationship. So how I really like, my own view is that we need to get to human children and have a different like educational kind of intervention than what is in their overt curriculum and what's also in their hidden curriculum. And a lot of us have talked about, and I've talked about myself in my writing and otherwise, about like solidarity and cross, coalitions. But let's face it, that's really hard, and, Dinesh's work and other people's work have talked about how difficult it is. And, just kind of being kind of in the legal field, reading kind of the recent judgment of Happy, the elephant, and the United States, as some people may know about the Bronx Zoo. So, Angela has written a piece of this, and others probably have followed or otherwise writing about it. If you read so this went against Happy, for those may know who might know. And if you read the kind of two dissents and their conversation with the majority, my analysis is so you have two dissents who, from what I can tell, are racialized judges who are for Happy, right? And they are trying to make the argument that, hey, this legal, old, long-standing common law tool of unlawful detention to call into question, habeas corpus, to bring it out. There have been, extensions of this across human groups, and now it's time to think about non-human animals as the petitioners claim. And again, like the majority, in a very public way that I have never seen in any legal forum in terms of talking about race and animal issues that are cited in academia, as we're talking today, came out in this judgment. And the majority is just like this hard psychological block, as I would analyze it. saying we can't talk about animals, it's odious to do so for basically racial anxiety reasons, even though you have two dissenting judges, one of whom is, from the photo, visibly Black, saying it's time to extend this to happy. And so where does all that anxiety come from, right? It comes from kind of growing up and then being privy to certain politics and views and not understanding the nuances of each. And then where does all this kind of other, let's say, psychological blocks come from? If we look at the social psychology literature on veganism and otherwise, and interspecies model of prejudice and otherwise, we would think that there's some real barriers here. So perhaps going back to Patrice and her psychology background, and others who have that as well, it would be, I think we need more kind of understanding of what it really is going to take for change, whether it's with environmentalists or otherwise. And if it really does look hopeless, as Lori might say, with making kind of hoping for change too much with the adult population, perhaps it's a real time to try to double down efforts with children. Of course, that involves adults, but for myself, I think we have a disproportionate attention on change with adults, and not to say that that ship may have sailed, but perhaps we need to think like of the earlier generation where all these identity issues aren't yet so entrenched. Thank you.
I think it's a really important point, but I also, as a bit of a pushback, I think there's a need to think about the problem of pushing responsibility onto children when if things aren't done in the very, very near future, the world they're going to inhabit is going to be almost irreparable. So, Greta Thunberg, her famous line of like, how dare you tell us we're your hope, right? That is basically saying, if the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees is basically like, the window is closing if it hasn't already closed for that degree of warming. 2030 is the absolute, and I mean the language of last chances keeps getting pushed back, but how many chances do we get at a last chance? But it's the urgency is just before we get to the thought of teaching children to in a different way about interspecies relations, which I entirely agree with, but I think we have to be very, very cautious about the urgency of massive changes in the coming decade with respect to climate and biodiversity, right? The big biodiversity report that came out had the same message where it's like there's a 10-year window here of huge change if there's any hope of averting this catastrophic trajectory. And so that I think it's not necessarily to, your point is very well taken, but also to keep it in mind with that.
I just saw, because of children in my life, the movie Lightyear. I don't know if anyone's seen that. Anyway, it's rated G, but it's like the most violent thing I've seen. Like, I was like, isn't it supposed to be like Toy Story, which I haven't even seen, but like her good. Anyway, but there were like, in terms of movies that I may have seen in my youth, decades ago, it was still like a white male lead, Buzz Lightyear, but more of a much more multicultural cast. So definitely like, some type of anti-racist consciousness in the film. And the main side peripheral actor, the secondary actor was like presented as a Black lesbian, and the whole family narrative around her family. Okay, so there's that aspect going on for the children. And there's a message from what I could tell, my own interpretation is about it's okay to make mistakes and you can just keep trying, and teamwork. And I don't know and despite everything we've talked about in all the mainstream media, some side story about the vending machine and clearly in English, a meat sandwich. And so one character there is from the future or missed all these preceding years of change, and the others went through it. And now a sandwich is 2 meat slices and the bread in the middle. And they're like, how did you ever eat it otherwise? Oh, this is much better. And like a complete celebration of eating more in this film, despite everything else going on in society, and despite the other changing messages for kids, right? And so you have those other changing messages, this is staying the same. And I'm totally with you with the urgency, but it seems like, who is underwriting this film, who is supporting this film, going back to the capitalist relations, and how is this message, like, it does seem hopeless it's ever going to be cognizant with some type of change in other realms.
I'll just be short because I'm super fascinated by this conversation, and like, children are the future, children are the hope for the future. And I just want to throw one little spicy wrench in things and think about the relationship between abolition as it relates to animals and abolition of things like the family structure as like a normative kind of family structure, and thinking less about this reproductive futurity. Even the idea that like kids are the future assumes a certain way that kids are kind of central to kind of futurity, and links up to these bigger questions around extinction and the extinction of the species Homo sapiens, and all of these other queer futurities that I think many people speak of. I'm sure we can talk about lots of people thinking through this in relation to different kinds of kinship networks. So I think there's something about even the supposition that children, and then people probably have different like personal takes on that too. There's a whole kind of antinatalist argument that could be brought up. So just another, the Buzz Lightyear movie not only presumes meat is the future, but that everyone will keep having families kind of in the same way. I'm not, but so I think it's a good text.
Yeah. I mean, one other point that made me think of was Donna Haraway's paper about making kin, not babies, which I think is a really brilliant just volley into a really difficult argument in environmentalism, because so much of the environmental discussion around population is so loaded with racism, and that is something that it's still important to talk about population. There's 8 billion humans heading towards 10 billion people, and that at some level bears on environmental pressure. I mean, it's something I've talked about livestock as the other population bomb, but and environmentalists have had, there's a lot of radical environmentalists who've tried to be very cautious of talking about population in relation to unequal consumption and environmental footprints and that sort of thing. But then saying population is still there, it's still something that matters at some level. And I think Haraway's the idea of making kin, not babies, part of what she's taught, or the center part of that is thinking about compassion, multi-species compassion in a context of reducing our species dominance in this planet. So that's made me think of that.
Okay, awesome. So do you have a question? Can you go so fast?
Is it okay? Do I have time?
Yes.
Okay, it's just something really quick. I was actually going to ask almost the exact same question that Rose did about like, and I almost wish Dinesh was here so I could ask like, okay, revolutionary radical politics. What do you think about those? Is that also false hope, or is that really something that we can sink our teeth into? But instead of asking that question, I just had a thought of what you were both just talking about places where we can have some agency, and thinking about abortion and clinics and places that need support and places that we can support, and how many more babies that are potentially not wanted that are going to be coming into the world after the decision in the States. And just that being a place for intervention in all of this that maybe is not a connection that's often made in animal or environmental politics.